Ted Bundy, the BTK killer, Charles Manson, Eileen Wuornos, Joseph Mengele, aka the Angel of Death. All of these people have something in common: psychopathy. They have something else in common as well: murder. When Ted Bundy was young, he was charming, articulate, and incredibly intelligent. He interned for various political leaders, aspired to be the governor of Washington, and was viewed as, by those who knew him, goal-oriented and incredibly driven. Nobody knew that the handsome young man who would often be seen around college campuses wearing tennis gear or dapper suits would turn out to be one of the most notorious serial killers and psychopaths of our time. He would confess to the murders of 30 women, although the true number remains unknown, by strangling, bludgeoning, and other methods that would make your stomach turn. Eileen Wuornos was a hitchhiking prostitute from Michigan who killed 7 men during her travels in Florida in the name of self-defense. She had a very traumatic childhood, including teenage parents who divorced while Eileen and her siblings were very young. Her father was a sexual child predator who died in prison, while her mother abandoned her children at their early age. Eileen, then called Lee, and her brother Keith were adopted by her neglectful maternal grandparents. Eileen proceeded to have a child at 14 before putting him up for adoption. Lee later fell in love with a woman named Tyria during her travels and hitchhiking, and they were able to get by in motels by using money made via prostitution. Eventually, Lee murdered multiple men, claiming that she was raped or beaten by them. Tyria knew, but didn't ask about it. Those who supported her claimed that she was a strong and independent woman who was standing up for women's sexuality and finally saying no to the men who just asked too much. Charles Manson, born in 1934 in Ohio, was brought into this life with a cruel strike from God. His mother was a prostitute who put him into a reform school, where he ran away numerous times and began his life of crime. It started out as non-violent: petty theft, bouncing checks, stealing cars. Things began to turn south when, while living at the Spahn Ranch in California, a friend of Manson's decided to make a drug deal, which went south very quickly. More drug deals occurred, more deaths happened, until one night, Sharon Tate, an actress who was 8 months pregnant at the time, was murdered in the Tate home by Manson's family, along with 3 of her friends. Manson continued to point his family in the direction of rich homes, where their inhabitants were brutally slaughtered and their properties vandalized with the victims' own blood, including one wall smeared with the words that are now all too well known by the general public: "Helter Skelter." Over the course of the last 10 years or so, as television has expanded and more subjects are considered acceptable on the silver screen, there have been numerous shows and movies focusing on the subject of psychopathic serial killers. The classic slasher films of the 70s are a prime example of this. Halloween with the traumatized Michael Myers and the Scream Queen Jamie Lee Curtis herself, Friday the 13th with the mourning murderous mother of a child who drowned due to the negligence of teenage camp counselors, or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre with the family that took great joy in murdering a couple of teenagers who had the great misfortune to fall into their path. There are even TV shows dedicated to this very subject of macabre killers: Criminal Minds, NCIS, Law & Order, Dexter, and countless others. They are among the most popular shows and movies airing on television, and the characters with the most fans are usually the killers. It has been romanticized. Nowadays, the killers are alluring and attractive, vampiric and not unlike a succubus or a siren. What made people like Bundy, Manson, or Wuornos so terrifying yet so fascinating to me was the mystery shrouding their psychological profiles and their motivations. What made them commit these heinous acts? Was there a reason, or was it simply a difference in brain structure? Are those with psychopathic tendencies predisposed to criminal behavior, and what would generally be classified as evil? Why are we, as a society, so interested in the macabre and dangerous, especially the people like this? Their brains are different from those of us who are considered normal. I want to know why this is, and why society reacts to them as it does. One thing that frequently confuses the public is the definition of psychopathy versus sociopathy. The definition of psychopathy, according to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is a mental disorder, especially when marked by egocentric and antisocial activity, while sociopathy is defined as of, relating to, or characterized by asocial or antisocial behavior or an antisocial personality. The terms have very similar definitions, and some medical dictionaries categorize them as synonymous. Both illnesses have a commonality of anti-personality disorder, or APD. Based solely on the stems of each word, socio, meaning social, sociological, or of society, suggests that the defined sociopath would have more focus or center around people, relationships, and societal functioning. Psycho, meaning mind or mental, suggests that a psychopathic definition is more internal and pertaining to the individual's mind rather than how they interact in society. Many medical individuals tend to use them interchangeably, however there is still debate around the matter. For the sake of simplicity in this episode, they will be relatively synonymous, however we will be mainly using the term psychopathic or psychopath. Historically, the definition of what makes someone psychopathic or sociopathic is fairly recent. As psychology is considered a relatively young science, we have arguably barely scratched the surface as to what the human mind can do and is capable of doing. There are multiple checklists and tests that medical professionals can run to diagnose someone with psychopathy, the most prominent and popular being Robert Hare's Psychopathy Checklist, revised, or the PCLR. Other definitions began with Hervey Cleckley in 1941, Dr. L. Robbins in 1966, Hare's PCLR in 2003, Lilienfeld and Widows in 2005, Patrick Fowles and Kruger in 2009, Linham et al. In 2011, and more contributions. As the definitions and diagnoses processes of psychopathy have evolved, so has its relationship with the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Many of the checklists and definitions of psychopathy did not make it into the DSM at first. However, similar conditions like antisocial personality disorder were included in earlier editions. ASPD was added mainly due to the research and observations made by Dr. Robbins, based heavily on Cleckley's psychopathy checklist. However, her definitions excludes some key elements of Cleckley's, such as shamelessness, inability to learn or grow from an experience, lack of emotional depth, and egocentricity. Her requirements for subjects were also very specific. They had to have some form of abstract dysfunction, as well as alcohol or drug abuse and suicidal tendencies. Contrary to popular belief, antisocial and antipersonality behaviors is not a direct result of psychopathy itself, but rather, antisocial behavior is the consequences of the affective emotional impairments and should not be considered as one of the diagnostic criteria, according to Cook and Michie. Cleckley's checklist originally began with 21 diagnostic features, later reduced to 16. Most all of these lists generated by various psychiatrists and researchers includes egocentrism, superficial charm, lack of guilt or remorse, pathological lying, lack of empathy, and other similar traits. The PCLR and other checklists have highly similar criteria, with small differences. Despite the fact that the samples in a recent study taken were not screened for possible confounding variables such as drug or alcohol abuse, which can affect facial recognition patterns, there was a correlation between psychopaths and recognition of the facial expression of fear. In a fairly recent statistical study using a random sample of groups of criminal psychopaths, regular criminals, non-criminal psychopaths, and non-psychopathic non-criminals showed that those who were psychopathic did significantly worse when identifying and discerning images of faces expressing fear. There has been debate of the use of the PCLR as a predictor of behavior known psychopathic offenders in the medical and legal world. The test is relatively reliable when it comes to diagnoses and prediction, but oddly enough, it is not considered a predictor for violent behavior while an offender is still incarcerated. Despite the PCLR's inability to predict violent behavior while one remains incarcerated, it still holds the ability to predict a relapse, so to speak. This means that, for example, if a criminal with psychopathic behavior was incarcerated, the PCLR would not be able to predict behavior exhibited in prison. However, or if the inmate was released, the PCLR would likely be able to predict if the individual would revert back to psychopathic criminal behaviors. Others wonder if those who suffer from psychopathic tendencies and show sign of psychopathy are predisposed to criminal behavior. This has more to do with the definition of psychopathy itself rather than a bias. Should criminal behavior be a component of classification of psychopathy? Something I found myself growing more curious about while researching this subject is how those affected by psychopathic tendencies may have different brain patterns than neurotypical folks. Are they actually different? What causes the difference? Is it genetic? Does it stem from possible external head trauma, or is it something that some people are simply destined to suffer? Upon further inspection of this query, various stories of folks whose temperaments and personalities change due to physical brain trauma has appeared numerous times. The most famous of these is the enigmatic tale of Phineas Gage, a railroad worker who lived during the 19th century. On September 13th of 1848 in Vermont, Gage and his team were finishing a day clearing out space to build a railroad. One of his co-workers at the time poured gunpowder into a hole drilled into the rock, which they would then ignite to blow up and clear a path. Gage had gone to tamp down a covering material over the gunpowder with an iron shaft and accidentally ignited. This resulted in the iron shaft being driven directly through Phineas's skull. Gage apparently reports being completely conscious through the entire process of being transported to the nearest town and was even able to carry a conversation with others. A little while after his accident, Gage fell into a coma and developed an infection at the wound site. After this had cleared up, his coworkers and friends had reported his personality as being completely changed. He had gone from a mild-mannered railroad employee to an irritable and angry man. It has been written that his intelligence and memory seemed undamaged, but that the equilibrium or balance, so to speak, between his intellectual faculty and animal propensities had been destroyed, according to Gale. The unfortunate story of Phineas Gage doesn't specifically pertain to psychopathic tendencies themselves. However, it shows some insight that tells us that trauma and external effects can change one's behavior drastically. Another instance of one's temperament being flipped upside down lies within the case of patient EVR. This individual suffered from a tumor in his brain, and in order to get it removed, parts of his frontal cortex, the area of the brain mostly pertaining to decision-making, emotion, and personality, had been excised or removed along with the tumor. Although his marriage had previously been stable, he divorced his wife of many years and quickly entered into a second short-lived marriage. Whereas formerly he had a keen business sense with considerable financial success, post-surgically he entered into a series of disastrous business ventures over a brief period of time. He had been a respected community leader, but since the tumor resection, he had never been able to maintain employment and now lives in a sheltered environment. This is according to the scientists who were monitoring patient EVR. Other than physical differences caused by the outside forces to the brain, it turns out that those with psychopathic tendencies actually have an observable difference in how their brains function. Not only do neurotypicals and psychopaths have different brain structure, but different kinds of psychopaths have varying brain structure within their classification as well. In a general sense, there are two basic types of psychopaths, successful and unsuccessful. What qualifies a psychopath as successful is how they seem to live their life. Many successful psychopaths are high-functioning within society and hold high-up jobs such as doctors, physicians, lawyers, and many businessmen. In fact, statistically, in a general population, there are anywhere from 0.6 to 1% of the population being considered as psychopathic, whereas 3.5% of the population of businessmen are considered psychopathic. Successful psychopaths also tend to not fill out all of the checklists completely and are considered as a manifestation as the condition rather than a full-on embodiment. They are classified as psychopathic due to their superficial charm, manipulation, and egocentricity rather than the criminal behavior or major lack of empathy, although this does not mean that primary traits are not included as well in some cases. Many successful psychopaths have different patterns in their brain when they think and structurally, and are mostly even considered enhanced. This is including better executive functioning, increased autonomic activity, normative volumes of prefrontal, gray, and amygdala, and normal frontal functioning may serve as factors that protect successful psychopaths from conviction and allow them to attain their life goals using more covert and nonviolent approaches, according to Gao and Rain. Unsuccessful psychopaths are different from successful ones in that they are more prone to criminal behavior and have structural brain deficits including reduced autonomic reactivity, impaired executive functioning, and risky decision-making, causing them to use aggressive modes of manipulation more commonly than successful psychopaths. It is also suggested that unsuccessful psychopaths have a reduced prefrontal gray matter and amygdala volumes, as well as an abnormal symmetry of the hippocampus. These are integral parts of the brain regarding emotions and decision-making. This can be inferred as a possible reason why these individuals are less susceptible to cues indicating danger and potential capture, therefore making them unsuccessful. Another commonality of brain structure and function with the psychopaths that are successful and unsuccessful alike, more specifically adolescents showing signs of psychopathic behavior, is the presence of a certain genotype, a certain type of dopamine enzyme pertaining to the conversion of dopamine to norepinephrine, which is also linked to major depressive conditions and primarily controls the fight or flight response in humans. The observations of these links are still fairly new, but they show strong correlations between callous and emotional traits in psychopathy. It is still a little bit cloudy as to if this is a hereditary thing or if it's just something normal. As well as psychopaths being split into two groups consisting of successful and unsuccessful, there is another way to split psychopathic behaviors. Type 1, or primary psychopathy, mostly considered successful, and Type 2, or secondary psychopathy, mostly considered unsuccessful. Type 1 consists of the emotional or lack thereof and interpersonal aspects of psychopathy, while Type 2 consists of the social deviance that comes with psychopathic tendencies. Some examples of primary psychopaths are usually the ones that are also considered successful, such as physicians, politicians, or businessmen. Secondary psychopaths are usually the unsuccessful ones that are more widely known, the burglars, serial killers, and criminals. When it comes to relationships, especially romantic, it is not surprising that those with psychopathic tendencies tend to perform poorly. With their lack of empathy and emotional unavailability, many seem to view them as a poor choice in partner. On paper, this makes sense. One wouldn't want to be romantically involved with someone who doesn't care about them, never regrets anything no matter how bad it is, and is a master manipulator and liar, and is grossly arrogant and egocentric. So why are we drawn to this subject and these people? What makes the seemingly insane and dangerous bad boy so attractive to so many? According to Stephen King's essay on why we crave horror movies and the generally macabre, we want an adrenaline rush. There's something alluring to experiencing the dangerous potential that someone can have. The idea that anyone can snap, anyone can be so horrendous. We like to know what could happen, and watching it occur, almost even experiencing it ourselves, is morbidly unchained and makes our nastiest fantasies realized, according to King. By consuming media about these wild happenings in our world that could be so real and that could actually happen, we can vicariously experience it too, without the consequences. Realistically, the 12-year-old pining for the oh-so-dangerous and attractive vampire Edward would probably be scared out of their mind if their fantasy became their reality. It is said that opposites attract. Bubbly and outgoing attracts sullen and introverted. Calm and collected attracts outrageous and opportunistic. Closed off and callous attracts open and willing. We want what we can't have, and what's more distant than the emotionally unavailable. It is important to keep an objective and critical eye on subjects such as this. In every argument, both sides must be accounted for before making a decision of any kind. We see it in courtrooms, sibling squabbles, and even breakups. This does not forego bias against those who are different from us mentally or physically. Although there are figures in this world, real or fictional, who are psychopathic and dangerous, such as Ted Bundy, Eileen Wuornos, or even Hannibal Lecter, although there are figures in the world, real or fictional, who are psychopathic and dangerous, such as Ted Bundy, Eileen Wuornos, or Hannibal Lecter, there are figures who could be considered psychopathic and functioning members of society, such as Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, or Sherlock Holmes. Those who are considered to be psychopathic are, without a doubt, a fear-inducing subject to those who do not know much about them. After all, from the outside perspective and what the media portrays, psychopaths are cruel, sadistic killers who are destined for madness. In reality, it is simply a difference in the structuring of the brain. Many killers who are aligned with psychopathic tendencies have other variables, such as unstable home lives and/or absentee parents. This does not mean that all psychopaths are set on a one-way street to the life of crime or murder. Despite the statistics pointing to many psychopaths ending in criminal lives, this is not true for all of them, only the unsuccessful ones. I do not believe that the term unsuccessful alludes to not successfully hiding their evil in society, but rather not successfully managing their illness and staying in society's good graces. Psychopathy should not be a condemnation, despite the raging critics and terrifying portrayals of the media. I concede that psychopathic tendencies can be frightening, and I'm not saying that it isn't a factor in serial offenses, but the public outright fear and ostracizing of these people, these humans, can very well be alienating to those not doing any harm, but simply trying to fit in and lead a normal life. The motives of psychopaths, at least unsuccessful criminal ones, may never be known to the outside world. After all, we don't see the world as they do. What we do know is that psychopaths have an observable difference in their brains, and, like Phineas Gage, temperaments and personalities can change not only genetically or from birth, but from external trauma as well. Not all psychopaths are destined for criminal behavior. They simply are not like the rest of the general populace. What makes this subject so interesting to us, as Mr. King spoke of, and as people show every day, is a morbid curiosity and a thirst for something exciting and different, to unconsequently live life vicariously through those different from us. When it comes to the end of the day, all of us are different. Some are just more different than others. Bias can be incredibly harmful, in my experience, and can cause insecurity and a feeling to subscribe to social norms of stereotypes, which in the cases of psychopathic or sociopathic behavior can even be dangerous to others or themselves. Through our lives and the fears we will encounter, whether it's from the future, other people, or those described here, we must not forget the words of Mahatma Gandhi before making a judgment about that person or parts of our population. You must not lose faith in humanity. Humanity is like an ocean. If a few drops of the ocean are dirty, the ocean does not become dirty. Margaret Thatcher, Winston Churchill, Sherlock Holmes, the famous detective who saved lives and whose stories inspires hundreds and entertains people to this very day. All of these people have something in common: psychopathy. They have something else in common as well: humanity. Today's episode, A View into Psychopathic Tendencies, is sponsored by Caper Mattress, bringing you the saltiest, tastiest sleep. Deliciously squishy, the smell of the vinegar will lull even the most extreme insomniacs to sleep. Get a limited time discount with the promo code PsychoCaper1, PSYCHOCAPER1. This podcast episode was written, produced, and recorded by Bella Briganti. A special thanks to Matt Couch and Frankie Briganti. Background music was by Disparition. All Disparition music can be found at www.disparition.bandcamp.com.